everybody to this fourth session of the Generating Respect Conference on religious leaders' influence from the field, sort of a view from the field that's drawing on a lot of really fascinating interview research, specifically in Jordan and Libya. And our first paper is going to be presented by Ella Allen and from IDARE. And I'm going to turn it over to her. And Ella, I'll chat to you, or you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this for 2 minutes, 1 minute, and then this for when you're out of time. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm just going to try and share my presentation. Just give me 1 second. Just let me know if you can see the presentation or not.
You can see it, but it looks quite small.
Okay. How's that? No?
No, it's still, I think it's probably big enough, but we can see this, the slides numbered on the left. So maybe if you go to slideshow and press play.
Yeah, I need another document. 1 second. Can you see everything on my screen or?
No, just the PowerPoint window.
Is the PowerPoint any, wait.
It's a little bit bigger now. Yeah, that's better.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, 1 second, sorry. Just trying to get ready.
Ella, there is a button at the bottom of, apologies, I couldn't hear for a few seconds. That's why I didn't reply, Tanisha. There is a little button on the bottom of your screen.
Mm-hmm.
If you press on it, you will see a slideshow. That the next to the minus, just the one next to the minus, do you see just at the bottom of your screen on your PowerPoint? That one. Press that one.
Okay, I don't think I can see my other document though, then that's the thing.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah. Is this okay for now?
It's fine. Go ahead.
Perfect. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Ioana and Ezekiel for the invitation to speak at this conference. It is an honor to be here with such incredible scholars. I'm currently working in Jordan, and my research focuses on the influence of women religious actors in enhancing international humanitarian compliance in Jordan. Jordan is an interesting case study because of its geographical significance. Despite Jordan remaining a stable state, it does contribute substantially to the number of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, with fighters from Jordan named as one of the top 3 Arab foreign fighters in these countries. It is widely recognized that armed non-state actors in Syria and Iraq are committing a wide range of violations to both IHL and human rights law. 97.2% of the population of Jordan are Muslims. So studies have shown that Muslims living in Jordan are predominantly consult religious leaders for guidance, signifying their power to influence norm behavior. Religious actors in Jordan therefore have a huge scope for influencing compliance with IHR. Multiple scholars have analyzed the intersections of Islam with IHR. This research intersects IHL with violent extremism research, arguing that the dissemination of humanitarian values can reduce support for extremist narratives and thus occasion greater compliance with IHL. I argue that religious actors operate in the foundational stages of influencing norm behavior. The research therefore aims to be a novel outlook to religious actors' capacity to influence IHL at this level in Jordan. There's a significant lacuna in the literature concerning the role and capacity of female religious actors, which is most notable in respect to Islam. A visible role of female religious actors is largely inexistent in Islam. While female religious actors are not officially recognized in Jordan, the research project has found that women play a significant role in influencing Islamic beliefs. The research focuses on 2 key questions The first question analyzes the structure of female religious actors in Jordan and assesses how the structure affects their ability to influence compliance with IHL. The second question investigates religious actors' power and/or capacity to influence IHL in Jordan, highlighting factors that limit this capacity. In Jordan, there are no recognized female imams, and a visible structure of female religious actors is inexistent. I, however, found that in reality, female religious actors exist in every community in Jordan and possess a unique social legitimacy in the community, having access to homes, gatherings, occasions, particularly with other women and children. It is therefore essential to recognize that female religious actors' roles transcend spaces, activities, and institutions conventionally demarcated as religious. I found that female religious figures in Jordan are more analogous to religious teachers. All interviewees believed that female religious actors have a role in disseminating Islamic values compliant with IHL. Building on the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and 2242, these resolutions specifically recognize the need to engage with female religious leaders on countering and preventing violent extremism. The research has highlighted 3 different categories of religious actors. These operate mainly in 3 social settings, namely schools, women's section of the mosque, and in religious centers, also known as learning institutes. Every government school in Jordan has a subject named Islamic religion, where children learn teachings from the Quran and Hadith. The majority of school teachers are female and were described as a role model for many children, with children looking to both religious teachers and their mothers to learn Islamic values and beliefs. The Islamic laws of war are taught in the Islamic religion classes, therefore suggesting that school teachers have a significant potential to influence IHL compliance. Additionally, both sexes of children attend the mosque with their mother when they're children, entering the women's area of the mosque and learning from the female religious teacher there. Religious teachers at religious institutes were also seen to have a significant influence. Save the Quran, a religious charity for female Muslims in Jordan, was highlighted by the majority of participants, with 90% of female interviewees having attended these centers as a child from the ages of 8 to 14 years old. This center is restricted to women only of any age and exists in every community in all governorates of Jordan. The center has significant social aspect and was emphasized as a place where women can express themselves freely. I found mixed opinions about the role of the religious teachers at these centers, with many participants arguing that the female religious teachers have a strict, mechanical way of disseminating religious advice, often spreading false ideologies in their opinions. I found that the religious teachers often lack the basic tools, critical thinking techniques, and empowerment to be a positive influence on women in the community and their ability to disseminate Islamic values compatible with IHL. I argue that to engage with these female religious actors, it is necessary to take into account the conservative attitude and approach topics carefully and sensitively, making direct links with IHL and recognized Quranic values with a focus on female empowerment. The second research question of this study investigates whether religious actors have the power and/or capacity to influence compliance with IHL in Jordan. I argue that whilst religious actors have the power to influence IHL in Jordan, in that they are heavily respected, their beliefs are easily accepted, the capacity of religious actors is restricted in Jordan and facing further constraints due to heavy securitization of religious figures and institutions by the government. My research argues that in order to engage religious leaders with disseminating IHL, dialogue needs to focus on compatibility with IHL. The influence of religious ideology on violent extremists suggests that religious leaders are well positioned to disseminate values that counter these narratives, suggesting potential power and capacity to do this. The research highlighted that the lack of comprehensive structured Islamic education is one of the central factors contributing to individuals being radicalized. Two separate categories of religious education were alluded to in the research, namely formal education provided by schools and informal education provided by mosques and the religious institutes. Participants generally argued that greater religious education and awareness would prevent individuals from becoming radicalized. Participants, however, argued that this is not possible under the current school curriculum. In 2016, the government made changes to textbooks, removing entire Islamic verses from the Quran. Participants argued that removing or reducing basic Islamic education in schools will only lead more children to go online and potentially be indoctrinated by extremist beliefs. A move towards secularism and a reduction in Islamic teachings could be argued to reduce religious teachers' ability to use Islamic values to enhance compliance with IHL. The link between Islam and humanitarian values is important, as it provides religious justifications for complying with IHL in a country where Islam is present in all aspects of society. Additionally, using Islamic teachings to disseminate IHL assists children to determine what the true interpretation is when they are faced with extremist justifications based in Islam for committing humanitarian crimes. A minor proportion of participants argued that their religious education was comprehensive, and it did teach them humanitarian values and the Islamic rules of war. These participants, however, were based in the capital city, and I argued that the location of religious actors can have an influence on their capacity to influence with IHL. The school curriculum in the government school remains the same in the more economically deprived areas outside of the capital city. However, it has been argued that the imams, sheikhs, and religious teachers receive a more basic and outdated education in these areas, which solidifies already existing conservative, radical religious attitudes. The research highlighted that these more economically deprived areas are being listed as the central recruiting grounds for extremist groups in Iraq and Syria. I also found that religious actors in these areas are more unwilling to engage in discussion around IHL. The second possible method of influencing compliance with IHL is through informal education, through the religious institutes and the mosques. However, these spaces have similarly faced a government crackdown in the name of preventing extremism. For example, the government now controls topics and verses used each week for Friday prayers. Participants have argued that increasing control over informal Islamic education could ultimately reduce free speech, healthy discussion, and the ability to make your own ideas about what is right and wrong. I argue that increasing government control places religious actors in a more constrained position to use creativity and critical thinking to teach compliance with IHL. I further contend that the government appealing to religious believers to be more moderate in the face of world events could contribute ultimately to disempowerment. This disempowerment has been visible in Jordan and was apparent in the study. Multiple participants in the research similarly noted the unwillingness and fear of religious actors to discuss violent extremism and its relationship with Islam. This leads to a religious education that disseminates incomplete information, which can be argued to be more destructive than helpful. A lack of spaces where people feel they can have these informal discussions could lead to more individuals going online and being manipulated by extremist beliefs. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to ask any questions in the Q&A box.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ella. That was really terrific. It was a really illuminating presentation. So I'm going to turn it over now to Hasnaa El Jamali and Ioana Cismas. They might need a minute to, Ella, can you stop sharing your screen? That way they can share theirs. Hasnaa and Ioana, do you have slides?
Yes, I'm trying to share them now.
Okay, great.
I hope you see them now, right?
Yes, that's
okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
So I would just like to say that it's going to be Hasnaa presenting on our behalf. It's mainly her work that you will hear here, so she should have the spotlight. So I'm just going to retreat in the background.
Okay, great. I did realize because of the webinar format that probably Ella couldn't see me going like 2 and 1. So Hasnaa, I'm going to chat to you. You'll see a chat when it's 2 minutes, 1 minute.
Perfect.
Okay.
I'll try to time myself as well.
All right, and if you're going really over, I'll just unmute.
Okay.
But please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Hasnaa El Jamali. I'm a researcher with the Generating Respect project. And in this paper, myself and Dr. Ioana, Cismas, we try to see the multifactorial influence of Madkhali Salafism on Libyan armed actors. And to guide you a bit on my presentation, I will first start with the Libyan conflict, brief history and the main actors. Then I will move to introduce what is the Madkhali Salafism ideology in Libya. And I will finish with highlighting the influence and the conclusions in our paper. First, so the conflict in Libya is complex with the multitude of different non-state armed groups, foreign fighters, and the involvement of different international and regional actors. The civil war in Libya started in 2014 and lasted until 2018. Then it was followed by the battle over Tripoli that was led by General Khalifa Haftar in 2019, and it ended up with a ceasefire on 2020. All of this in a context where the country has been split into 2 parallel rival political and military camps. With 2 different governments. The first one is the government of national accord based in the west in Tripoli, and the second one is Haftar Libyan National Army in the east. Of course, the 2 of them also benefited from support from different armed groups and international actors, and they even have their own religious endowment bodies in both sides. In 2021, under the UN-led Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, the new national unity government was established, and I can say that it's the first unified government since the start of the conflict in Libya. However, this government is facing a lot of challenges, naming a fragmented security sector and armed groups, difficulties in unifying the military command, and difficulties in getting out different foreign fighters in the country, and also political challenges, especially with the upcoming elections this month that were delayed actually 2 days ago to February. So in such a hybridization context, a Salafi group emerged, and it's known as the Madkhali Salafi group, which has exerted some influence on armed actors. And through the Generating Respect project, we managed to map and identify 18 armed actors in Libya. 6 of them, they have a Madkhali-leaning element. Of course, despite the fact that Libyan context is said to be dominated by localism and communalism, but we see here that the Madkhali armed groups, they are affiliated in both rival parts. For instance, in the West, I can cite here the Special Deterrence Force, which is a very influential armed force in Tripoli with a strong Madkhali element. And it was under the GNA, the Government of National Accord, and now it is under the Government of National Unity. On the other side, on the rival side, we identified 2 major groups, Subul Salam and the Sa'iqa Force. They are under the lead of Khalifa Haftar, and they have a strong military, strong Madkhali element as well. So the question that we raised here is, how can the same ideology, in fact, be adopted by rival groups? And in order to deconstruct this question, I will first introduce the Madkhali Salafism ideology briefly. So the ideology found its roots in Saudi Arabia in the 90s with the Saudi cleric Rabi' al-Madkhali. Then it was introduced to Libya by students who studied either in Saudi Arabia or Yemen. And for time constraint, I will focus on two main core principles for this ideology. The first one is the obedience to the ruler. Madkhali Salafism exalts and glorifies the ruler, what is known in Arabic Wali al-Amr, and this obedience is provided at all times. And apparently the obedience seems owed irrespective of the tendencies of the ruler towards authoritarianism. And this was proved when the Madkhali Salafism were the natural ally for the government, for the regime of Gaddafi. And even after the revolution, they issued a fatwa clarifying that the legitimate ruler was the Gaddafi then. Throughout our paper, we actually noticed a certain malleability of this core principle. Such malleability respond to other types of elements, regardless of the religion one, be it local affinities or different political and economic interests. And to be clear, I will cite a small example here. For instance, in 2019, with the attack of Haftar to control Tripoli, the Special Deterrence Force, which is based in Tripoli, and especially the Madkhali element inside the armed group, were divided into two categories. One who saw Haftar as the legitimate Wali al-Amr, or the legitimate ruler, and the other part was regarded the government of national accord as the legitimate ruler. The second core principle that I will discuss here is the quietist notion that this ideology is known for. So what I mean here by the quietist is that it's the withdrawal from the political affairs. Like, the ideology has been described as being apolitical. But I would argue that in the case of Libya, it's nothing but apolitical. Actually, it played a crucial role in influencing the political scene in Libya. And I would even add to it that it took advantage of the weak political institutions since the start of the conflict in the country. My third and last point actually reflects on the influence of both religious leaders and armed groups in the context of Libya. And here I will mention some of our conclusions through the paper. So first, we saw that the influence of both armed groups and religious leaders emerges as a relational process. And what I mean by here is that the Madkhali individuals or the institutional religious leaders claim a special legitimacy. And I think already Chris touched based on this special legitimacy on his presentation. So this legitimacy is used to interpret religious areas within a bearing on humanitarian norms compliance. And what I mean by here is that, for instance, whose side to participate in hostilities and how to behave in wars, and even how to control or govern populations and their youth control. Of course, the religious leaders use different methods. I would state three important ones, or mainly tools. The first one is the fatwa, which is the religious interpretation to spread their messages. And the second one is the control over religious endowment bodies, which in Libya, they play a crucial role. Not only they are economically and politically and even religiously really important in the context of Libya. And the last tool is using actually social media and media outlets, because it was found out that almost 30 media outlets are controlled by Madkhali ideology as well. And of course, this claim is often validated by armed groups. However, we cannot forget that armed groups are not passive themselves, and they have their own agency, and they have their own agency and interests that sometimes go beyond the religious one. And the last conclusion is that this relational process actually is shaped by three main factors that we found out. Well, the first one is the religious ideology that I already talked about. And the second one is the communal, local, tribal, and regional factors. Well, the Madkhali ideology is said to be above tribal consideration, But in this case, in Libya, we found out that it's not always true. And I will, to make it easy, I will state two main examples. The first one is that there was a fatwa that was issued by an endowment body with a Madkhali leaning, where the fatwa considered the Ibadi or the Ibadiya in Arabic. It's another sect in Libya where 4% of the population in Libya adheres to. So the fatwa regarded this Ibadi sect as deviant and misguided. And another fatwa that was issued by actually a Saudi cleric named Al-Utaybi, where he banned women from traveling unless they are accompanied by a male guardian. So both of the fatwas, they were really, they faced a condemnation from the local population. Which brings me to our main conclusions, which is like that localism and communalism actually in this case resulted in temporary violation of IHL perpetrated in this case with the Madkhali one. And the third and last factor is the economic one, where basically the armed groups, they take advantage of their, they want to take advantage from salaries provided by the state, etc. So it's an ongoing research. And we are trying through the Generate and Respect project. Now we're conducting interviews, and we're still trying to see how these three factors are playing still a crucial role, or if something will change, especially that the conflicts in Libya is changing and the development, we cannot even follow the development. And with this, I will leave the floor and thank you for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ella and Hasnaa, and also Ioana, who is a silent co-author there. I'm just trying to, okay. All right, so I'm going to start timing myself as well. And I want to just encourage people to please put questions using the Q&A if you're in the general audience. And then if you are a panelist, please put questions in the chat. All right, so let me just say I want to make a few remarks about both papers first, and then I'll address each paper in turn. And regarding both papers, I just wanted to say first that there's really a very impressive amount of research behind both papers, and really interesting research as well. And I want to take a moment to appreciate how challenging it is always to conduct this kind of ethnographic research, and how much more challenging it must have been to do so in the context of a pandemic. So I want to congratulate the authors for the significant accomplishment. And I also want to commend them for the thoughtfulness that they brought to each paper. And I'm going to highlight two common threads. I just want to flag them for you now in my comments. And I always view my job as a commentator to be a little bit critical to, with the eye to making the papers better, right? So it's kind of boring if I just only tell you everything I like. I want to try and be constructive and give you a path forward. So along that vein, I think, one common thread that you're going to hear me talk a little bit about is that both papers kind of have an assumption that religion matters. In that they are looking at how religion matters for IHL compliance. But there's a way in which I think you can read both papers as actually questioning whether or how much religion matters for IHL compliance. And I think that this is worth thinking about, both for these papers and perhaps also for the broader project. And then another thread that is common to both of these papers is that they are wrestling with extremism. And how and whether extremism fits with the analysis of the relationship between religion and compliance with international humanitarian law. And as someone who also works in this space, I very much sympathize with this challenge. This is a problem that many, many scholars have tried to solve, and I don't feel like we've been all that successful. But I do think it's important to be explicit about how we are thinking about extremism. And in particular, you don't need to come up with your own definition, but I think you want to be upfront about how you're identifying extremists ex ante. And again, because I think this is very much wrapped up in popular discourse around religion and IHL compliance, especially when we're talking about Islam, which is the religion that both of these papers address. All right, so let me start with Ella's paper, the influence of women religious actors in enhancing international humanitarian compliance in Jordan. I'm not going to summarize the paper because Ella did a fantastic job presenting it. But I want to say that there are, I think, a lot of really fascinating threads in this paper. I especially appreciated the gendered analysis. I think that the exploration of women's role in Islam in Jordan is really important. And it's quite a creative take, I thought, to focus on a state that produces foreign fighters rather than one that is itself mired in internal conflict, and I think provides a lot of really interesting opportunities. I do wonder, though, whether the two questions framing the paper, the role of women on the one hand and the role of religion and religious institutions on the other, might mean that this might work better as two separate papers. But let me just pose some questions that the paper raised for me. So one question that I had when reading the paper, but I think Ella in the presentation kind of addressed this to some extent, but I still want to flag it for her, it is the stage at which you, Ella, expect influence from women as religious leaders. And how might this influence differ across stages? So in the talk, you mentioned the foundational stage of norm recruitment, but other stages like recruitment, targeting or participation, demobilization or de-radicalization are also alluded to in the paper. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about those. You also discussed, Ella, the importance of highlighting the compatibility of Islam with international humanitarian law. And while, of course, the non-hierarchical structure of Islam makes settling on an authoritative interpretation challenging, there is, I would argue, a great deal of overlap between what we might think of as public international humanitarian law or Western international humanitarian law, that tradition, and Islamic humanitarian law. And I think you can stipulate that to some extent. You end up arguing that the key role of women occurs at this foundational moment of norm formulation. And you mentioned, for example, that one of the participants highlighted the importance of learning Islamic humanitarian law at school. And here I would love to see more about the content, just to my previous point about the substantive overlap between different traditions in humanitarian law. So what was the content, or what do you see as the content of Islamic humanitarian law that people are learning in school? And then a thread, again, running throughout is how you deal with extremist groups in this context. And I wanted, again, to hear more on that. I mean, from a policy perspective, you argue for institutionalizing Islamic education more, but you also point to government crackdowns on religious organizations for fear of extremism. And I came away wondering how you reconcile these tensions as a matter of policy. Yeah. And then one last question is that you find that women religious leaders are especially influential vis-a-vis women and girls. And it struck me that there's an interesting opportunity here to think about how this finding might intersect with the role of female fighters in Islamic identifying armed non-state actors. And then so finally, and this is the point I was making earlier, you ask at the start whether the structure of female religious actors in Jordan affects their ability to influence, and whether religious actors have the power and or capacity to influence compliance with IHL in Jordan. And I think that the answer to both questions is probably it depends. And while you offer some answers on what it depends on, I would urge you to explore these nuances further. All right, okay, I'm taking more time than I meant to. So let me turn now to Hasnaa and Ioana's paper. Again, I'm not going to summarize, but I'll offer some comments. So let me say first that not knowing anything myself about Madkhali Salafism and not being a specialist in Libya, I learned a great deal from this paper, and I really appreciate your embrace of the complex political and religious landscape in Libya right now. But my main comment is actually one that Hasnaa kind of alluded to in framing the paper, which is that by exposing all of the internal contradictions of Madkhali Salafism, it ends up, this strain of Salafism ends up seeming like an empty vessel. In other words, its malleability seems to leave it without doctrine, which is foundational to religion. That's how we think about religion. So if its quietist nature can be used to support violence, and its insistence on allegiance or obedience to a leader can be used to support any leader, then how much content does Madkhali Salafism really have in this particular context? In other words, it seems to be deployed so strategically that it lacks any consistent structure. And this point leads me to another question or concern. Again, one of the threads that I flagged for you that I would focus on, which is, what if there is little to no relationship between religion on one hand and compliance with IHL in this conflict? I worry a bit that you're trying to force a connection without acknowledging that such a connection might not exist. And so, here it would be helpful, although I concede a great deal of work to compare Madkhali Salafist groups to groups that are subscribing to other religious traditions or other religions. Do we observe differences in behavior that fall along religious lines? Ultimately, I'm not sure that you answer the question that you pose on page 7, which is whether non-compliance with humanitarian norms is traceable to the influence of Madkhali religious leaders. But I thought that where the paper is most interesting is in the discussion of authority grounded in Weber. And I wondered whether the authority of Madkhali religious leaders is simply a function of them being religious leaders rather than a function of them being leaders of a particular religion. And so the last specific comment I'll make on this paper is that I agree very much with what Hasnaa said at the end, which is, refers to the importance of localism. I suspect that in this context, imperatives that refer to politics, governance, and strategy end up being the most consequential when we're talking about compliance with IHL. So let me just wrap up again by congratulating these authors, but returning to this point about, and really trying to push you a little bit about not assuming a relationship between religion and compliance with IHL, because I do think it's important to attend to the politics here. And another way to phrase this would be to ask, under what conditions do religious actors or religion, under what conditions does religion condition compliance with IHL? All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. The one question is a procedural question about whether we can find whether the papers are available. And I'm going to let one of the organizers of the conference address that question. So let me just, in that case, since we have about 5 minutes left, ask Ella and Hasnaa if they wanted to respond to each other's papers or respond to other comments.
Actually, I can respond to a comment. Actually, thank you, Tanisha. Actually, you're right. Like we have been discussing as a group within the General Respects project of this relationship that maybe religious leaders might not be the only actor who has a role there, especially in Libya. Then throughout my interviews and discussing with other stakeholders, we noticed that maybe we can have another actor who are the tribal leaders, actually, who might influence more given the nature of the Libyan society. So it's on a later stage that we are actually mapping the different tribal leaders. Actually, there are many in Libya, you cannot imagine, and their potential role, which I'm sure they have a great deal within the IHL. So point taken, it's not really a focus on religious leaders, but we are also considering that other actors might also play a role within this. Yeah, then maybe I leave Ella the floor.
Yeah, just to sort of talk about that, actually, about the, our religious leaders. the big influences is like, do they have a big capacity to do this? I think in Jordan, I don't think they are doing it to a significant extent, but I think what the research has highlighted is the potential power and capacity they have to do that, especially the women. And I think as well, with the influence of the religious institutes, the children are going there every week and throughout the school holidays from the ages of 8 to 14. That's a huge influence that these female teachers are having. And, if we can have some kind of discussion and dialogue with them about the similarities with IHL and the values, then I think that it could have a huge impact, especially with religious teachers in schools as well, with influencing people to not then subsequently become radicalized by these ideas. And I think a lot of the participants have said to me that, anyone who's going to join these groups and believes these justifications that these groups are providing, they don't know the true values of Islam. This is what everyone has said to me. And they don't have this basic foundation of Islamic education. It's not there. So I think there is real potential for that to happen, and that for these religious actors to have a greater influence than they do now in respect to compliance.
Elle, can I just ask, sort of along those, just to follow up on what you're saying then, do you have a sense of either the content or the variation in content of the kind of religious education that the women who you're studying are offering? Because it seems like that's really where you could get a lot of leverage on this.
I think with reference to the specific content, I haven't got specific information on specifically what's being taught, but when I've spoke to a lot of youth and a lot of female youth and asked them about what is being said and are they learning, the Islamic values of war and things like that. And they're saying that they are being taught this in schools and also in the religious centers. But it's to the extent I need to do more research into it. And one of the biggest difficulties of this whole project, actually, because of the sensitivity of the topic and the government crackdown, is trying to get religious teachers and the people from the institutes to talk, because they're really frightened. The intelligence services here are on really high alert about this. So it has actually been very difficult to get specifics on the actual content which is being taught, but I am trying still to get more information on that.
That's great. Yeah,
I'm aware that this is being recorded. Yeah, sorry, be careful. Oh,
okay.
Sorry.
Thank you for that reminder.
Can I just jump in, Tanisha?
Please.
On a follow-up question that you asked, so the silent person comes comes to the table as well. I think it's a really, really good question, and thank you so much for your comments, and we'll definitely look to address them. But the comment that you made, that you started with, that we assume a relationship between religious actors and compliance or non-compliance, I should say, with IHL. I think we're assuming it because we have evidence that there is a relationship.
We have such clear evidence
in the case of Libya that it's incredible. However, what is really, really important is that it's not the influence of religion, it's the influence of religious interpretations by certain actors, the legitimacy of whom is validated by armed actors. The reason why they validate the legitimacy may be religious ideology, but what we're actually finding out, it's not that. It's economic interest. It's other kind of interests that interact together. So the biggest mistake, I would say, that we could make is to essentialize religion as this is why they do this. This is why they do not comply with IHL. They use justifications put forward in fatwas not to comply with IHL or to target certain religious minorities. So we have that. But the reason why they do that, yes, there may be a shared religious ideology, but there are so many other reasons, among which economic, political reasons, and indeed aspects relating to localist communalism and so on. I think what's fascinating is that this localism and communalism these are aspects usually portrayed in the context of Libya as creating this chaos in institutions, and it's true. However, in this particular context of norm compliance and the examples we have, but we wouldn't generalize, it has functioned as a force limiting the negative influence of religious actors. So it's really interesting. It's local populations based on their ties with the armed groups that have had such a negative reaction to the fatwas that the armed groups had to pull back. So it's what I would say is stay away from essentializing the economic factor, stay away from essentializing the political factor, the local factor, as well as the religious factor. One doesn't explain everything, and it's their interaction that is interesting. Yeah.
So we're a little bit over time. Can we chat for another minute or two? Okay, so I just wanted to push you a little bit and say that on a few fronts. So first, let me just underline again that I really appreciate the your embrace of the complexity of the case. And I especially liked the way that Hasnaa framed this puzzle at the beginning, which is, you have these rival groups that are apparently subscribing to the same religious tradition, but they're rival groups. So how do we reconcile that? It strikes me that without really knowing anything about this particular tradition, right? So this is a little bit of a shot in the dark. But based on your paper, I wonder if one way that you can reconcile that, or one contribution to reconciling that, is this focus within Madkhali Salafism of on allegiance to the leader, right? That the specific role that the leader has allows that kind of dichotomy in terms of the landscape of the conflict. But Ioana, I also want to push back a little bit. I mean, while recognizing that we don't want to essentialize specific factors, I always worry that if it's everything, right? If everything is the answer to the question, then it's nothing, right? And then it's really hard to figure out what to do with that. And it ends up being descriptive and not, and I think there's a lot of value in description, but if you have to decide what the purpose of the work is. If it's purely descriptive, that's one thing, but my sense is that you want it to be at least as analytical as descriptive. And if that is the case, then there needs to be a clear takeaway. And again, if it's everything, then it's nothing.
I agree with you, but I think I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I think, however, if you look at this particular ideology, Madkhali ideology, in other contexts beyond Libya, you see the same tension. There is a tension between the two principles, an intrinsic tension that we were discussing with Hasnaa, and that we have in many other religions and currents. It's an embedded flexibility that allows the religion to be applied in different ways, in different contexts. We have that in law as well, It's a context sensitivity. So I agree with you. I think Hasnaa's and mine aim is to narrow down the factors that explain this relational influence, faithful to the reality, the empirical reality that we see, to narrow them down without essentializing any of them, and to help with that humanitarian organization considering whether is it actually worth to engage with religious leaders in this Madkhali current. Should we actually engage with them? What could we achieve, and what do we have to consider? What is it that motivates their fatwas, and what is it that convinces armed groups to validate this legitimacy, it seems, in certain instances and not in others? So yeah, I guess that's where we're coming from. So we definitely want to go beyond description,
But we don't want to force a conclusion that is not supportive, basically. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I endorse all of that, including what the aim of the paper is. And maybe another way to frame it is to use that language of narrowing it down, in which case, you can say, well, we can't necessarily tell you what it is, but maybe we can tell you what it isn't.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, we just have the key to our paper.
Brilliant, thank you.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions. So with that, I want to, I hope we can all applaud. Is there a way to use the, no, there isn't a way to use the, so I'll just applaud Ella and Hasnaa and Ioana for 2 really excellent papers and presentations. And thank you both for all this research. I look forward to seeing what comes next.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanisha, for your great comments and for chairing the session.